December 20th, 1943. 30,000 feet over Germany, a B-17 bomber limped through the frozen air, half its engines dead, its tail shredded by cannon fire. Inside, 10 men clung to life. One was already gone. The bomber's pilot, a 21-year-old American named Charlie Brown, gripped the controls with blood-stiffened hands. The mission to Bremen was supposed to be his crew's first, but at this rate, it would be their last. Then, out of the clouds, a shape appeared. Sleek, fast. A German fighter. No guns fired, no evasive roll, just silence. The two aircraft hung in the sky together, predator and prey. The bomber barely flying, the fighter pristine and deadly. Charlie braced for the final burst of gunfire that would send them all down. But the shots never came. Instead, the German pilot eased his plane alongside the crippled bomber and looked directly into Charlie's eyes. And in that moment, something impossible happened. He chose not to kill. This is the true story of what happened next, when a single act of mercy cut through the heart of war. That morning, Charlie Brown's crew rolled their bomber onto the runway at RAF Seething in eastern England. Their B-17 was brand new, fresh paint, the name still barely dry on its nose art. Ye Old Pub. It was December 1943, and the Allies were striking deep into Germany's industrial heart. Brown's target was Bremen, a heavily defended city ringed with flak batteries and Luftwaffe interceptors. For a rookie crew, it was the definition of baptism by fire. At first, the mission went according to plan. Tight formation, steady altitude. Then the flak began. Explosions tore through the sky. Black bursts of shrapnel ripped into the formation. Ye Old Pub took a direct hit to the nose. One engine failed instantly, and another sputtered. The oxygen system was gone. Temperatures inside dropped below freezing. Then came the fighters. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swarming in. Cannon shells shredded the fuselage. The tail gunner was killed outright, while others were bleeding. Brown fought to keep the plane level, but every control felt dead in his hands. The bomber was alone now, falling behind the group, an easy target over enemy territory. Somehow, it kept flying. But in the chaos of smoke and blood, something appeared ahead. A single German fighter closing in. The German pilot was Franz Stigler, 26-year-old Luftwaffe ace. He had already shot down more than 24 Allied bombers. When he spotted Ye Old Pub drifting low and alone, he didn't see a plane. He saw an easy kill. He throttled forward and climbed up behind it, ready to finish the job. But as he closed in, his trigger finger froze. Through the shattered tail, he could see the damage inside. Gaping holes, torn metal, blood on the glass. He saw the rear gunner slumped motionless. He saw another man trying to tend to the wounded. Then he pulled alongside the cockpit. The young American pilot turned his head and their eyes met. Two men separated by nothing but a few feet of glass and air. Stigler remembered something his commanding officer had once told him. "If I ever see you shoot at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. You fight with honor, not cruelty." What he saw inside that B-17 wasn't an enemy. It was men who had already lost the fight. Instead of firing, he nodded. Then, to Brown's astonishment, Stigler began flying beside the Ye Old Pub, protecting it. He gestured for Brown to turn toward the coast. A German fighter escorting an American bomber out of Germany. It made no sense, but it was happening. For the next several minutes, the unthinkable unfolded across the German sky. Franz Stigler, Luftwaffe's decorated pilot, flew wingtip to wingtip with Ye Old Pub. Below them, anti-aircraft crews tracked the crippled bomber, but they didn't fire. They assumed the fighter was finishing the job. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown's crew couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some reached for their guns, but Brown shouted for them to hold fire. He didn't know why the German wasn't attacking, only that this strange truce might be their only chance to live. At the edge of the North Sea, Stigler gestured one last time, pointing west, home. Then he saluted, and Charlie Brown returned the gesture. As Stigler broke away and turned back toward Germany, the American bomber limped out over open water. 2 engines gone, holes through the wings, no navigation, no heat. Hours later, against every law of physics and probability, Ye Old Pub crossed the English coast and crash-landed at an airfield. The men stumbled out, frostbitten, half-conscious, but alive. When debriefed, Brown told his commanders what had happened. A German pilot had spared them, but they didn't believe him. The report was buried. And for decades, both men would live with that memory, a silent secret from opposite sides of the war. For both men, the war ended, but it never really left. Charlie Brown completed his missions, returned home to West Virginia, and eventually rejoined the U.S. military. He built a long, steady career, serving through the 1950s and 60s, traveling across Asia as a Foreign Service officer, and later retiring to Miami as an inventor and family man. But the nightmares followed him. He'd wake in a cold sweat, haunted not by his enemies, but by the one who had spared him, the German pilot who'd looked him in the eyes and chosen mercy. Franz Stigler's silence was heavier still. When he landed his damaged Messerschmitt near Bremen that December afternoon, he said nothing to anyone. In Hitler's Germany, sparing the enemy was treason. The penalty was death. So Franz buried the memory and kept flying. By war's end, Germany was in ruins. Franz's brother was dead, his country shattered, and the skies he once loved had turned to smoke. He refused to fly again in Europe. In 1953, he left Germany behind, sailing to Canada to start over. There in Vancouver, he rebuilt his life as a flight instructor and mechanic. He married, opened a small business, and tried to live quietly. But sometimes, late at night, he'd think back to the bomber that limped home because he had let it go. Two men on opposite sides of the world, each carrying the same memory, each wondering if the other had survived. For nearly half a century, neither would know the answer. By the mid-1980s, Charlie Brown was retired, living a quiet life in Miami. He'd served his country, raised a family, built a career, but one question still lingered. Older than his children, older than his marriage. Who was the German pilot who spared us? In 1986, at a reunion for World War II airmen, someone asked Charlie if he'd ever had a mission he'd never forgotten. He hesitated, then told the story. The crippled bomber, the fighter that appeared on their wing, the salute and the escort to safety. When he finished, the room fell silent. A friend urged him to try to find the pilot. It sounded impossible. 40 years had passed, Germany had changed, and most wartime records were gone. But Charlie couldn't let it go. He wrote letters, searched archives, and contacted veterans groups across Europe. Years went by, but nothing. Then in 1990, a letter arrived at his home in Miami. The return address read, Vancouver, Canada. Inside were 4 words. I was the one. Franz Stigler had seen Charlie's story printed in a combat pilot's newsletter. The dates, the details, they all matched. After 47 years, he finally knew that the bomber and its crew had survived. When the two men spoke for the first time on the phone, they both broke down before either could finish a sentence. 6 months later, they met in Seattle. Two former enemies, now old men, standing face to face after nearly half a century. No speeches, no ceremony, just a long, quiet embrace. Franz said softly, I love you, Charlie. From that day forward, they were brothers, visiting each other often, speaking every week, telling their story together at air shows and veterans gatherings. Charlie would later say that meeting Franz didn't just answer his question, it healed something in him that the war had broken. For the next 18 years, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler were inseparable. They traveled together across North America to air shows, museums, veterans gatherings, telling the story of that strange encounter in the skies over Germany. Two men once sworn to kill each other, now laughing, sharing meals, and meeting each other's families. Charlie's wife and Franz's wife became friends. Their children and grandchildren grew up knowing the story not as a legend, but as a family history. Proof that mercy can outlast war. Not everyone approved. Franz received letters from Germany calling him a traitor. Some Canadians couldn't understand why he'd risk his life to save Americans. But Franz never argued. He'd simply say, they would never understand. He knew that on that December morning in 1943, he hadn't been fighting for Germany or against America. He'd been fighting for what was left of his own humanity. In his later years, Franz gave Charlie a book with an inscription inside. In 1940, I lost my brother as a night fighter. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz. It was the kind of bond that only soldiers could understand, forged not through violence, but through restraint. Their friendship lasted until the end. Franz Stigler died in Vancouver on March 22, 2008, at the age of 92. 8 months later, Charlie Brown passed away in Miami, aged 86. They're buried thousands of miles apart, but their story remains bound together. Two men who met for 10 minutes in combat and became brothers for life. Their story was later told in the best-selling book, A Higher Call, but its real power isn't in print, it's in what it reveals. That even in the darkest places humanity creates, there's still room for grace. 47 years to find each other, 18 years together, and one choice made in the chaos of war that changed everything.